Olá, boa noite. Sejam todos muito bem-vindos.
Good evening, everyone. Welcome to our second global meeting. And I'd like to thank your participation here tonight. Please feel very welcome. Today we're going to talk about SDG 12, sustainable energy production, and the academia. I'd like to thank all of you who are watching us and those who are willing to debate and discuss this important topic. Thank you all to my colleagues at UNINTER who made this event possible, our team, school directors, our studio team, marketing, all our professors involved, so our translators. So thank you all who have helped tonight. You can send your questions in our chat box. And at the end of the two speeches, we will have some time for questions and answers. So I'm going to select some of the questions to our speakers so they can answer you. This roundtable is going to be in both English and Portuguese. If you want to follow in Portuguese, you're going to have your YouTube channel broadcasting it. And the one, if you want to watch it in English, you're going to have the YouTube Global Hub broadcast. In 2015, the UN proposed the new Sustainable Development Agenda for the next 15 years, the 2030 Agenda, comprising the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. This joined after brought together countries, companies, institutions, and the civil society to seek and ensure human rights and poverty, fight against inequality and injustice, achieve gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls, act against climate change, as well as addressing other greatest challenge of our time. So today we're going to talk about SDG 12. And to discuss this topic, we have two very special guests tonight. Our first speaker is Dr. Simon Granovsky-Larsen, and the second one is Professor André. Our roundtable will be organized in 4 parts. First, you're going to have Professor Simon's speech in English. Then you're going to have Professor André's speech in Portuguese. Then we're going to go to our third part, which is our Q&A, and it's going to be carried out in English with our translation. So please send your questions, and at the end, we're going to have our fourth part, which is our cultural moment, and then you're going to end tonight's event. So now I'm going to switch to English so that our speaker can understand us. I'm going to tell you a little bit about who he is.
And talk a little bit with you guys in English. In this evening, we're going to have a really, really special guest. They're going to talk with us a little bit about his work. So we're going to have here Dr. Simon Granovsky-Larsen. He's an associate professor of politics and international studies at University of Regina with a background in political science, international development, and Latin American studies. Simon's writing is interdisciplinary and has on Central America and more broadly. So his research explores social movements and political violence across Central America. His recent projects have looked at the expansion of renewable energy production in Central America, violence against land and environmental defenders, including the security practice of Canadian companies. Simon, we thank you so much for being here with us in this evening. Thank you so much for joining and accept to be here. I know that you are having all these family issues nowadays, so thank you very much. I'm gonna tell, so all the students, guys, just for you know, Dr. Simon, he's from Canada, but now he's in Mexico, and he has 4 kids, and the 4 of them are a little bit sick, and they are around, so it's possible that you can hear some of the kids, right, Simon?
Yeah, that's right. I don't think they'll be interrupting us. Thank you so much for that introduction, Carol. It's great to be here, and hello to everybody who's joining us today.
So, Simon, I have one first question to you, if I may ask. So we are talking here about the Sustainable Development Goal 12, and responsible consumption and production is about the unsustainable pattern of consumption and production as a root causes of triple planetary crisis of climate change, biodiversity loss, and pollution. So does that include production of energy?
Yeah, it absolutely does. I think the production and consumption of energy is absolutely central to the question that you've brought up here. When we refer to the production and consumption of energy, we're mainly talking about three main categories: electricity, transportation, and heating. Now, the world has seen some very significant and admirable advances in moving us away from the extraction and burning of fossil fuels that our economy and our lifestyles have really become deeply ingrained and dependent on. When we look at electricity especially, there's been an increase in the production of sources such as hydroelectricity using water, wind energy, solar power, and geothermal especially, as well as biomass energy and others. That's brought us to a point where about a third of the world's electricity now is produced using renewable sources. But when we look at transportation and heating, there's been much less of an advance towards moving us off of fossil fuels. And so for those areas, somewhere around 85% of the energy that's produced in the world for transportation and heating is still produced using fossil fuels of various sorts, oil, coal, and natural gas being the main ones among them. But something else that we need to take into account here is that even though the share of energy produced by renewable sources is growing, and especially in electricity, the amount of electricity, the amount of energy in all of these categories that the world is using is growing tremendously. So even while we're increasing the share of the total energy used that's coming from renewable sources, we're using more fossil fuels because we continue to grow our economies in a way that relies on that energy production. I think there's a couple of important points here. One is that I look at the Sustainable Development Goal 12, and I think that there's a real important missed opportunity in Goal 12. If we look at some of the other key goals of the SDGs, they're very ambitious. It might be recognized that those goals might not be met, but having such an ambitious goal as end all poverty everywhere, end all hunger, end all discrimination against women and girls and gender-based violence, these are aspirational goals that give us something to work towards. Why don't we have in SDG Goal 12 a statement that says, end the use of fossil fuels by the year 2030. Instead, we have very weak language that asks us to rationalize inefficient fossil fuel subsidies, to counter governments paying subsidies towards fossil fuel industries. And so this doesn't put the SDGs in a position of having a firm goal of moving away from fossil fuels towards renewable energy. The second point that I want to make is that even if we did move towards an entirely renewable-based energy system, there's problems associated with that I think we'll talk about in the upcoming questions. And I think that something that doesn't appear in the SDGs also is that we need to think about organizing our economies, looking after our basic needs and providing for people with comfortable and adequate lifestyles in ways that aren't centered around economic growth. If we continue to measure our economic well-being and the progress of nations solely in the growth of gross domestic product, then we're going to keep pushing for more and more energy production. And like I'm going to talk about in the upcoming questions, there's problems associated with any form of energy production. And so for me, I think that there's a contrast between looking for sustainable energy use and the Sustainable Development Goals, which encourage an increased and sustained global economic growth, which I think is ultimately going to be harmful for the planet.
Okay, so thinking just about what you just explained to us is a fact. We are constantly hearing about transition, energy transition, and clean energy, and so on, right? But we don't hear much about how this transition is happening, right? Just as you told us, we don't hear about ending petrol bases, but we also don't hear so much what is going on with these transitions. So from your research and your perspective, what have you seen in this matter in Central America?
Yeah, that's a really important question, because I think that there's been a shift in the general discourse where we've accepted that there's a necessity for an energy transition. Most people understand that that means a move away from fossil fuels, but I don't think that there's much recognition of what's involved in making that transition. I think on the one hand, you have quite a big disparity between the global north and the global south in terms of the conditions around the construction of new renewable energy projects, where what we're seeing in the global south is often a reproduction of the same colonial or dispossessing or exploitative conditions that surround traditional extractive industries like mining or oil and gas extraction. So unfortunately, you have the same sort of negative social and environmental consequences associated with the construction of renewable energy projects as well. Central America, where I've spent all of my time doing research since I became first a grad student and then a professor in Guatemala and recently in Costa Rica and Panama. The region of Central America has positioned itself really well for the energy transition. There's a long history of use of hydroelectric dams for producing electricity, going back over 100 years in the case of Costa Rica, and really receiving a lot of funding and attention from the mid-20th century forward across all of the countries of Central America. So there's an established hydroelectric sector, but what we've seen over the last 15 years or so, as there's really been this global promotion of a renewable energy transition, is incentives from within each country and also international incentives to construct more renewable energy projects, whether or not the countries where that energy is produced are in need of more projects. On the one hand, in addition to producing electricity for use domestically or for sale across the countries of Central America, because there is an infrastructure that allows for sale across the countries from Panama through Guatemala, there's been an additional market created for the sale of carbon credits. So if you finance and own a renewable energy project, whether that's a hydroelectric dam or a wind park or a solar panel park, you have the opportunity to not only sell that electricity at a profit, but also to sell the concept that producing that electricity saved the world from producing more carbon dioxide emissions. And those credits can be sold internationally. And so there's a real lucrative incentive of an international market to sell carbon credits. And what that's done is it's promoted the creation of hundreds of renewable energy projects across the region. In some cases, Costa Rica is a really prime example. There isn't any need within the domestic market to produce more renewable energy, to produce more electricity at all. Costa Rica already produces more than twice what the country actually consumes in terms of electricity. But there's a series of incentives, like I'm saying, within the country and internationally that make it profitable to generate renewable energy. So when we talk about the renewable energy transition, I think what's missing from the conversation is a question of the domestic electricity or energy markets, the balance of supply and demand, and looking at that in relation to the types of incentives that are being created, and then taking it down another level to ask, how does generating that energy affect the people who live around those projects? And I'll tell you a little more from the specific case of Costa Rica in an upcoming question.
Okay, Simon, I just, I do have more questions for you, but I think it's important for us just to remember that when we talk about renewable energy, we are talking, for example, about hydroelectric energy, right, Simon? It's a kind of renewable energy, clean energy. In Brazil, we are so used to it. So our students, we have more than 500 students here with us, watching us. And we are so used to that. So 90% of the energy in Brazil comes from hydroelectric. And that is a clean energy, right? But
can I jump in before your next question?
Sure, for sure.
Sorry,
no,
Carol. Well, I mean, I think you really have to question the term clean energy, especially around hydroelectricity. And there's been a bit of a shift, a global recognition that hydroelectric energy is really in its own category, a little bit separate from wind and solar and geothermal and others. Why is that? It's because first of all, damming rivers has a very negative effect on the ecosystem of the rivers. It changes the conditions for life within and around those rivers, often in a very damaging way. It involves a lot of deforestation as well. You're usually talking about hundreds or thousands of hectares of deforestation in order to create the infrastructure necessary for hydroelectricity. And then the process of maintaining a hydroelectric plant and generating electricity does rely on fossil fuels as well, and it pollutes within the water system also. And that's without getting into the social issues. So there's actually been a bit of a pushback on the idea that hydro is clean energy. You can question other sources of renewable energy as well, but there's a pretty clear case around hydro.
Okay, good. So I was just checking in the chat. The students were also talking about this. So I think now we could jump for my next question. So at the UN website, it says that the capacity of developing countries to generate electricity from renewable sources has soared over the last decade from 109.7 watts per capita in 2011 to 245 watts per capita in 2020. Is there a relation between Canada and the countries where you did your research? So you're from Canada, right, Simon? So is there some kind of relationship between Canada and these developing countries and energy?
Yeah, there really is, but it's not a very obvious one. And this is one of the main questions that I was looking at in the recent field work that I did in Costa Rica and in Panama. I think that when you ask that question, at least for myself, when I started this research project, what came to mind for me was direct ownership. So do Canadian companies own renewable energy projects in Central America? And I was actually surprised because I was surprised to find that they don't, because there's a lot of investment historically by Canadian investors and companies, and especially Canadian oil and gas companies and mining companies across the countries of Central America. And there still is today. Canadian companies dominate the mining sector in every country across Central America, for example. But when we look into renewable energy projects, including hydro, we don't see that level of Canadian ownership. In fact, there's a little over 700 renewable energy projects across the 6 countries of Central America, and only about 7 of them are owned or even partially owned by Canadian companies. So, but I still say that there's a big involvement. So where do we see that instead? Where we see it, I think, is if we start to appreciate that there's a very intricate web of investment and other activities surrounding all extractive industries. And when I say extractive industries, I'm referring to mining, oil and gas, also large-scale industrial agricultural production that's often used for energy sources as well, but also renewable energy, because there's an extractive relationship with nature in all renewable energy outfits. And so what I like to think of is Canadian involvement, but you could think about this for Brazil or other countries as well, and look to the categories that I see as ownership, investment, consumption, and production. So to give examples from Costa Rica, like I said, there's very little ownership, and I don't think that in Costa Rica itself, there are any renewable energy projects owned by a Canadian company. What we do see is Canadian investment. Individual Canadian investors, as well as Canadian-based banks that invest in renewable energy projects. Also public investment. We have a public pension plan called the Canadian Pension Plan in Canada that I'm a member of. And so it's contradictory. As much as I criticize this, I'm invested in renewable energy in Central America as well by virtue of being a member of this pension plan. The Canadian government also has a number of programs that they finance for climate change adaptation and mitigation, and many of those promote renewable energy in the region. And then you also have to think about Canada as a large donor and an influential decision maker within multilateral development banks like the World Bank. The Inter-American Development Bank, for example, plays a very large role in producing loans and grants that promote renewable energy. So all of this we could think of as investment. On the front of consumption, like I said, Canadian mining companies are very active in Central America, including in Costa Rica, although Costa Rica recently passed a ban on metals mining, but that was in response to a Canadian project. Canadian mining companies across Central America are some of the biggest consumers of electricity in each country across the region. And so when Costa Rica produces electricity and produces more than it needs domestically, it exports it to Nicaragua, it exports it to Panama, and a lot of that electricity goes directly to Canadian mining companies. There's also a range of other economic activity in Costa Rica and in the countries of Central America that aren't related to energy, but rely on a lot of electricity. So Intel, for example, that manufactures computer chips, has a manufacturing plant in Costa Rica, and those are exported from Costa Rica to Canada. So there's another link where we can think of our demand for those processing chips. It feeds into the web of producing more renewable energy there. And then finally, we can think about promotion, where we're not just investing or consuming or directly owning, but Canada, again, through the multilateral bodies that we're a part of, we play a big role, and we have historically going back to the 1990s, in promoting market-based solutions to the climate emergency. And so where there are multilateral discussions around regulation or other initiatives to respond to the climate emergency, Canada tends to lean heavily on market solutions. And so we see within Costa Rica, for example, projects that earn credits through the Clean Development Mechanism. This is something that Canada had a role in creating, where by having a hydroelectric dam, for example, you can earn credits because of that. And also Canada promotes the global international free trade based economy, which is one of the other large incentives for producing more renewable energy across Central America. There's a free trade of electricity through an infrastructure system that reaches across 6 countries. And so demand in El Salvador or Honduras can drive production in Costa Rica. Canada, through its free trade discussions and through its role at bodies like the World Trade Organization and the World Economic Forum, promotes this economic model. And so I think we can even look to that level as one of the ways that Canada is involved.
I'm sorry. So we have only 3 minutes and I have 2 questions. They're both really good, but I'm gonna have to choose one. So okay. I'm gonna choose one of those. So renewable represents over 1/3 of developing countries' total electricity generation capacity. In regions, for example, as Costa Rica, where was your research, did this implementation of renewable energy cause a conflict and pressure, especially on minorities?
Yeah, so I warned you that it would be hard to keep to 4 minutes, and I apologize for my role in dragging this on. So I'm gonna go right to the heart of this. Instead of explaining the political context around this in Costa Rica, which we could talk about more at some point, how does this impact people in Costa Rica around renewable energy projects and specifically hydroelectric dams? To answer that question, I think I have to explain, first of all, what rivers mean to people in Costa Rica. Costa Rica has a very large rural population, a large agriculturally based population, and it's also a country with a very strong sort of sense of conservation and environmentalism that individual people are very involved with. Beyond that, it's a country that is very, very rich in water. You can't go anywhere in the country without running across small or medium or large rivers that run through pretty much every town and municipality. One of the interview questions that I talked to people about in my recent research was, what does the river in this area mean to you? And you know, there's issues like the fact that a lot of rural communities or municipalities bring their drinking water from rivers and from the surrounding watershed areas. There's also economic issues like fishing and tourism, like rafting or something that happens with rivers. But a lot of people talked about the sort of psychological well-being that's associated with living near a river. That you have essentially kind of a public park that involves water. People go and they sit by the river, they think, they connect with the river, they have a lifelong relationship with the river. And a lot of people have real spiritual connections with rivers as well. And so when you have a hydroelectric dam that comes from within Costa Rica, but outside of the local area, and just plunks itself down on the river without consulting with people that live in that area in order to generate electricity that will provide profit to a private company rather than to the well-being of the people that live in that area, what they get in return is the loss of their river. You have stretches of dry river where dams are built, often up to 10 kilometers long, where the river is dry. In Costa Rica, the law allows for 90% of water to be removed from a river in order to build a hydroelectric dam. And so you're left with dry rocks, sometimes pasted in oil from the project, with the biodiversity lost, and with that connection with rivers, violently removed from people's lives as well, without them having a say in the matter. And so to summarize really quickly, Costa Rica recently saw a moment of about 8 years or so of a quick expansion of attempts to build hydroelectric dams that in a very, very genuine grassroots way, every community where these dams would affect started to organize in resistance to the dams. And there were a total of 35 dams across the country that ended up being canceled because of communities organizing against them. So on the one hand, a dam has a very negative impact on the communities surrounding it. But on the other hand, it's fed into sort of a moment of community organizing, grassroots organizing that shifted the conversation in the country around energy production. And in many cases has ended up having a good result in the end for people in the area.
Okay, Simon, thank you very much. Our time is over. I think I was unrealistic. Thinking about 5 questions, 4 is more than enough. So we can talk a little bit about the last question when we have the questions from the students in the chat. We do have a lot of students that are really interested about it. So, and they already did some questions that goes around that, so we can get back to that. So thank you very much. That was really enlightening and very, very important for all of our students. And they were in the chat just putting there, it's important, I think, for you to know that we have students from all around Brazil. So from all the states, and they are there showing how important this subject is to them. Yeah, so it's very, very nice. Thank you very much. And now I'm going to switch to Portuguese again, and I will be back to English when we have the questions. Bom, gente, agora vamos para a nossa segunda parte aqui da nossa noite. Vocês vão me ouvir agora um pouquinho em português. A gente tem agora um momento bastante especial. Antes de eu fazer a introdução...
Good, that's the second part of our evening. Before I talk about who's going to talk to us today, I forgot. Actually, people asked who I am. I didn't introduce myself. I'm Professor Caroline Cordeiro. I work here at the International Office, the Office of International Relations here. It's called the Total Hub. I'm actually in Canada right now. Talk to you from Canada. And the professor that are going to talk to us right now is a UNINTER professor. His name is André Frota. André holds a master in political science from the same class that I graduated. We studied in the Paraná Federal University. He's also an expert in environmental analysis. He has a PhD and he's licensed in geography. He's a professor of international relations, political science, and geography at UNINTER. His line of academic research is related to the following topics: conjuncture analysis, theory of international relations, Brazilian foreign policy, globalization, international governance, election geography, and geopolitics. So thank you so much, André, for being here today, for accepting our invitation and talking about SDG 12. Good evening, Professor Caroline, my dear students. It's a pleasure to be here with you today, talk to you from the Global Hub and the opportunity to expose UNINTER's contribution to this project. So it's a great pleasure to be here, sharing this space with you. Professor Caroline was my colleague, and she's always been my colleague in many different realms, right? So I could leave more time for Simon, and it will be a pleasure to listen to what Simon had to say. So I actually allow him to say a little bit more. So, but okay, sorry, André. Thinking about what Simon said, and also trying to think about what's going on in our chat box. I'm looking at everything, so it's important to say what is a typical student. So everything that Professor Simon mentioned today is a scientific research, is an academic research that Simon is developing in Central America, and it's gonna turn into a scientific paper. So thinking about this importance of scientific papers, scientific articles, and the importance of basing our opinion in academic research, serious research with methodology, as Professor Simon mentioned. André, I'd like to talk to you a little bit about this academic communication with the SDG. If you can talk a little bit more about your research group here at UNINTER and your article, United Nations Sustainable Development Objectives, International Literature Scope Review. We don't have much time, so I try to be very objective in my answers. It's a pleasure to be here and sharing the experience of the Global Hub and internationalizing this scientific contribution. When we talk about SDGs, and we look at the 17 SDGs, there is a gap, which is the role of academia in the 17 goals, especially on the number 12 that talks about sustainable consumption. We have to mention education and the role of the scientific contribution to the sustainable development. So this discussion between the academic world and the political world has to do with what I talk. I'm not going to talk very specifically about the techniques that I use, but when you talk about the SDGs, we have a journey in our SDGs.
Agenda 21, que começa como primeira agenda mais global para a gente pensar em objetivos compartilhados.
Agenda 21, which is the first more global agenda when you think about a more shared goal. The Agenda 21 didn't follow through as we expected. Then we have the Agenda 2030. So the Millennium Goal and the Sustainable Development Goals are different things. I mean, chronologically, they were close to one another. So starting in 2015, when we have finally the SDG platform, the one that we've been debating, and the internalization of the 2030 SDG agenda. It starts in October, September to October. And so that it starts in the academia, we will only see it in 2016. So this window of opportunity for the SDG as a whole has to be taken. It has to be. It started in 2016, not 2015. So the article that we wrote tried to show that there's a time of internalizing what is happening politically and what's happening in the academia, in the academic world. So I think that's the beginning of our conversation. So I don't know if I answered the question. So perfect, André. I have questions here. There's a group of professors watching us. Thank you so much, Lucas, Marcio, Carolina. Thank you so much for being here with us. Thank you for your participation. So I'm going to my second question. Together with me, with you, with Professor Simon, all of us who are discussing and debating the importance of science, André, I think that's very important to highlight. And you are talking exactly the outcome of your research with your research group. What would you say that is the current scenario of article publications, the main academic journals that are publishing articles and papers and so on and so forth? So start mentioning the metric information study. Please stop me when I run out of time, because if you allow me, I will keep talking. The metric studies is a very important field to map the scientific production. When we talk about the SDG, specifically the SDG 12, this it has some norms, which is a LOTCA norm, or the LOTCA law. It's based on chemistry study, a chemical article based on the empirical scientific production for a chemistry journal. You realize that there was a bunch of articles by few I mean, it's basically the 2080 law. It's the elitization of the academic production. What you can notice is that you have a volume of papers written by some authors, some professors, and a lot of people trying to use the references developed by some few articles and disseminating this information. There's a high concentration of scientific production. When you think about the collection and analysis techniques, we can see how it can be applied in different fields, especially in the SDGs. Now I want to share with you some charts here to show you how it all happens. Reginaldo, who is here with me today, he's going to help me with this task.
Share screen.
Take a second.
Beleza.
Very good.
Estão enxergando? Não, ainda não, né? Vamos lá.
Can you see it?
Agora sim. Estão?
Right, perfect. I think now you can see my slides.
Todos estão vendo? Perfeito. Agora eu vou colocar aqui na
Perfect.
apresentação e vou procurar ser
So
bem rápido.
I'll try to be very brief because we cannot miss our time, because it's very important for this global Earth space. Let's get into this first chart. It talks about the collection techniques. I'd like you to, we have people from the academia here. It's public of university students. So what does productivity mean? The number of publications from a specific source about a specific topic. That's productivity. That's quantity. And that's the results that you have here. So if you wanna, I'm gonna share the link so you can see this chart directly. All these charts are there. We can see there's a high concentration of SDGs in one specific journal. It's called Sustainability and Open Source Swiss Journal. And it shows exactly what Lotka was telling us. When you, in scientific production, we have a high concentration, and that's going to happen in this journal, but in also many others. When you go to another field which is impact, it's not production, but an impact, or how these journals circulate in the field, and how often they are quoted. Sustainability will give will lose space to the Lancet. For example, when you had COVID-19 and when you didn't really know what it was, the Lancet was a very important journal in this field, and it has a very important impact when you think about the SDG. We have other journals like the Sustainability Journal. It's less productive than the Lancet, but it's pretty much similar, but it has less impact. And then when you have this third chart that brings together the volume of publications, productivity and the H index, which we can see here, the quotations. This number starts showing different logic that goes around the final result. So how much this journals, what is the outcome and the importance of the outcome? So what is the structure of publication in a certain field, how the academy is organizing around the SDG. We have some journals that are the hotspot. They are the center, the core of publication of scientific research. And this journal is open, which is very rare in this field. It's something that is important for us to mention here, the role of science to reach the SDGs. Just to end the final question, this...
Com várias perguntas, juntando a palestra de vocês dois, mas os alunos também estão fazendo uma participação brilhante lá no chat, colocando várias perguntas, então vou deixar para os alunos. Mas acho que é importante a gente, então, pensar...
I think it's important to think, when you talk about SDG, as you mentioned, in terms of publications, we think about technical publications connected to science journals, like biology, for example. Other areas, for example, are also studying and publishing about the SDGs. I'm going to be very brief here. And this question, I have more data here. This is not part of the article that they published in 2022, but I just got this data. And basically, I'm using Scopus. it's a large repository, it's a service provided by IT company in terms of scientific information. And this is one of the large global libraries. Scopus is the one who provided with this information. I collected data for the past few years and how this field is really, really decentralized. When you think about sustainable development goals, I'm not talking about only the SDG 12. I'm talking about all of them. The social science is a very active field in the sustainable development. It has a very important participation in the index journals, but it doesn't have the same prominence as those coming from medicine and health and so on and so forth. But when you have the SDG and we put the goals in the UN framework, we can see the importance of the SDGs. Now, when I go to environmental fields, engineering, computer science, all fields somehow contribute. This volume, Professor Caroline, and I apologize, I still have a lot to say. All fields are contributors. So when you think about the SDG, starting from, from 2015 to now, we don't have much time in terms of information. Science needs a lot of time to be able to systematize information about a certain topic. I think this is some data that we need to review. I think that we need to have a more specific SDG for the academic world. I got a very interesting comment from Silvara, but I'm going to ask you my following question, specifically about SDG 12. SDG 12 talks about sustainable production, and it also mentions energy. Do you know any publications? Is it possible to map the publications based on the SDGs? Actually, somehow it seems like this slide was prepared for this presentation. We were trying to share that we got from this specific paper that I published. I produced an information that I find very interesting. For example, SDG 12, we have a more restrictive time, specifically because of the scope. We have 161 documents. When we mention SDG 12 in English, okay? I'm speaking Portuguese, but all the terms are mentioned in English. It's a very restricted document. The number of scientific articles that we have is around 5,000. Here we are talking about 160, 170. We are very specific for SDG 12, and we can see here the lactic law, the lactic norm, and we can see that we have a very active field, which is chemistry, and it's one of the largest chemistry journals. It's called Chain. That's the name of the journal. And this is the one that produces more information about the SDG. At least that's how they mention that's what you get from their metadata. So it's very active in the academic world, and chemistry has a very important role in this SDG. Now, two more charts very briefly, and I think that it's a very important topic when we talked about the interaction between the academia and the political world is academic production. I think that's one of the most important techniques. I'm not going to get in much details here, but we know that there are some production networks. Who works with whom, and how is this interaction happening? When you think about SDG 12, we can see there is a division between Chinese production and the Western production, especially North American production. And this division can be seen in these clusters of university collaboration. And the University of California on one side and the Beijing University on the other. So, I mean, Peking and Beijing, it's the same thing, but it's just a matter of terminology. But the issue is the SDG 12 challenge, which is brings us to a greater challenge, which is this strategic.
Eu queria encerrar, então, essa pergunta, professora Carolina, com um último slide, tá? Mostrando
China and the US. And I'd like to end with my final slide showing how it's present in terms of scientific, global scientific collaboration. Now we have some very thin lines of scientific collaboration among countries. Specifically, when you think about North and South, very, very, very low. And this event's a way of trying to break the stigma. I think it's a communication that is very centered in countries on the North Hemisphere. This map is from a different paper. It shows in terms of, I mean, better to understand the weight of a scientific code. Now it's concentrated in the Northern Hemisphere and how challenging it is. And especially when you think about SDG 12, we see that it's part of the SDG 12, and this event is very, very interesting. Try to come up with an answer. Professor André, thank you so much. It was an excellent presentation. I will have many more questions, but I won't have time for the final question, but it was great. Thank you so much. And it's great that we have the opportunity to do so. We are here trying to connect North and South, North America with Latin America as a whole.
Obrigada pela apresentação.
And thanks so much for your presentation. We don't have much time for Q&A, but I'll try to have at least one question for each one of you. Now I'm going to switch to English so we can have it one single part.
I'm going to do one question to each one of you. We don't going to have a lot of time to do much more questions. But before I do the questions, I would like to read, for the first question, I would like to read 2 comments that we got from one student in the chat. So Adriana made this comment. She said, more we produce with focus, we have been producing more with focus on sustainable development, but the more we produce, the more natural resources we are using, contradicting the idea of long-term sustainability. And I think this comment was, I did translate it, it was made in Portuguese, but I think that is a really key one to think about it, right, Simon? Especially if we try to make this effort of critical thinking, especially. And then, so we're gonna do one question, and if André, if you would like to comment, because I know that you have your background in geography, and I know that you really understand also about this. So what the students that they are asking is something that we face a lot in Brazil, is how can we make that possible? How can we make that accessible for the population? So I'm gonna read the question from Isabel, but it represents a lot of questions that were in our chat. So Isabel Cristina, she asked, can renewable energies in the future be accessible to the most needy population? I know that is a tough question, but I'm gonna challenge you guys on that one. If Simon, could you start it?
It's a good question. I think they can be accessible, and there's examples where they are. Unfortunately, I think what we often see is that they're made inaccessible. And I spoke mostly about Costa Rica today, but I also did research in Panama, and there were two sort of main geographic areas that I was focused on, and in both of those areas, there were both hydroelectric dams and wind energy parks that had been constructed in the midst of communities that don't have electricity. And so you have the wind towers or the hydroelectric dam affecting the territory, and the transmission lines passing through farmers' fields with houses that don't have access to electricity. And this is unfortunately a very common problem, especially in the global south. But can they be made more accessible? Absolutely. I think that there's two main keys, or maybe three main keys off the top of my head to that. One is to look to alternative economic systems, and especially indigenous knowledge on economic production and sustainability. And looking to ways, traditional uses of energy that can be more accessible and more equitable, but also thinking in terms of stronger state regulation of especially private energy markets, so that there are requirements that are enforced in terms of how energy is produced, the involvement of citizens, and then how it's distributed equitably as well. And then finally, there are a lot of very good examples of small scale renewable energy projects of a number of types of sectors, wind, solar, hydro, that are community owned or cooperatively owned and managed by the people who use that energy themselves. So in one great example that I know of in Guatemala, there's a set of 8 communities that each built a hydroelectric dam in the rivers in their area. They generate electricity for themselves, and they were able to to build the dams in a way that didn't have a negative impact on the territory that they live in, because it's what they rely on themselves for their lives. So I think that there's promising examples out there for how renewable energy can be produced responsibly and made accessible. It's just a question of political will in terms of how we get there.
Thank you so much, Simon. Actually, we did have comments of a student. Well, one student was talking about indigenous and how we could get this knowledge from indigenous people to think about energy. So you already talked about it. And also we had one student that was, actually more than one student that was comment that in some regions of Brazil, people don't have electricity. And so you also touched that. So thank you very much. And I do have one more question. The time is just flying by, but I do have one question. So before I started, I just would like to read one comment from our student Silmara, sorry. So Silmara said, the publication of scientific production seems to be monopolized. And that's a really interesting comment, right? We as academic, we know how those things work, but we have to talk about it. And it's still in academia, we have this pressure of publishing and you have to publicize your work and so on. So André, I would like to hear from you. How do you think that the academia could contribute to think about sustainability? That was one of the questions that came out from the students.
Yes, thank you very much, Caroline. I think I would like to connect the last question with this one, because I think we can try to link these two, because the scientific information is very important to make these renewable technologies cheaper. We need scientific information in South America, for example, to produce and make innovation with this renewable technology. To make this cheaper and more accessible to all people, we need to share, the rich countries need to share more their technology, their information, scientific information. So I think these two questions are, in my opinion, very linked. You know, so we could think in this way.
Okay, thank you very much. We don't have time for more questions, but it was amazing. Thank you guys very much. Everyone's keeping saying that 1 hour is just too short for everything that is so important for us to hear. But thank you very much for this moment. And for sure, I feel that we connected in some way, the South America and North America in this evening. So thank you very much. Now I'm going to switch again back to Portuguese. Professora Flor, seja muito bem-vinda. Muito obrigada.
Welcome, Professor Flor. Now we're going to our fourth part of this evening, our cultural presentation. Thank you so much. I'm going to present one more cultural moment. Choro is a rhythm that brings together a type of music brought from Portugal and some music from the African enslaved that came to Brazil. So the groups are called regional, quote unquote, and the interpreters, they have a specific name. And before, it was considered a way of doing music. It has like very happy melodies, and it brings the virtuosism of its interpreters. And the song that we are going to present today is a classic song from Valdir Azevedo, and our student Ralph Souza will interpret it to you.
Que delícia, né, Caroline, encerrar a noite com uma apresentação tão bela.
Beautiful to end this evening with such talented student. And tomorrow I will be back to a third day of our global meeting. So thank you so much, Professor Flores. I missed Brazilian music. It was awesome to listen to Ralph, sorry. So thank you so much for our speakers, to everybody who helped us today. It's always a challenge to do it in two languages, and I hope you have learned a little bit from us. And tomorrow we have one more evening with a lot of content, so not to miss. I wish you all good studies. Bye-bye.